When the guns fell silent at Appomattox, the Civil War ended. But the nation didn't slow down. In many ways, it accelerated. The same federal government that had mobilized armies, built railroads, and managed total war now turns its attention west. The same soldiers who marched through Virginia and Georgia looked for land, work, and purpose. And the same country that had nearly torn itself apart now faced a different question altogether. What would America become when it finally filled the continent it claimed? The West after Appomattox was not an empty horizon. It was contested, dangerous, chaotic, and full of opportunity. And the decisions made there would shape the United States just as deeply as anything decided on the battlefields of the Civil War. Welcome to our republic.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands,
sailors and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force.
Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the founding fathers. Not
Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be.
we pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
The end of the war released millions of men back into civilian life. Veterans returned home hardened by experiences, accustomed to discipline, and often unable to return to what life had been before 1861. For many, the answer was the West. The federal government encouraged this movement. Laws passed during the war, especially the Homestead Act, now came into full effect. Land that had once been theoretical had suddenly become available. Railroads advertised opportunities. Newspapers printed stories of fertile soil, mineral wealth, and fresh starts. The West became the outlet for a nation that had spent 4 years consuming itself. But this movement was not gentle. Settlers did not arrive gradually, they arrived in waves. And where they went, order followed slowly, sometimes not at all. Before the Civil War, federal authority in the West had been limited and uneven. After Appomattox, that changed. The war had proven that a national government could act decisively, raise armies, and enforce policy. That machinery did not disappear. It moved westward. Federal troops garrisoned forts across the plains. Marshals enforced federal law. Surveyors mapped lands. Federal courts followed settlers. Railroads expanded under government protection, and Washington was no longer distant. It was present. This was not empire building in the European sense. This was consolidation. The republic was filling in its own borders. And that process brought conflict. For Native American tribes post-war, the post-war West was catastrophic. Treaties made earlier in the century collapsed under pressure from settlement, mining, and railroad construction. Hunting grounds vanished, game disappeared, and promises were broken or reinterpreted. The result was a series of wars, not one conflict, but many. Campaigns stretched across the plains into the Southwest, fought by soldiers who had just survived the Civil War and now found themselves enforcing federal policy on the frontier. These were not abstract clashes. They were brutal, personal, and final. Entire ways of life collided with an expanding nation that was no longer willing to slow down. The West would be secured and not peacefully. The post-war West was not driven by land alone. It was also driven by money. Gold and silver rushes transformed quiet regions into instant population centers. Towns appeared almost overnight. Laws lagged behind opportunity, and violence followed quickly. Miners, speculators, and corporations clashed over claims. Vigilante justice filled gaps where courts did not exist yet. And federal authority eventually followed, but always after chaos had already done its damage. The rush tied the West into national and global markets. Wealth flowed east, railroads followed, and power consolidated. And as long as the West belonged to young men, it remained unstable. When families arrived, everything changed. Women and children in churches, schools, and permanent homes formed camps into towns and towns into states. The presence of families demanded law, order, and predictability. Civilization followed necessity. This process marked the quiet end of the frontier. And by the 1890, the Census Bureau would declare it closed. Not because land vanished, but because the line between wilderness and civilization no longer existed. America was no longer expanding into unknown space. The West, after Appomattox, reshaped the nation. It accelerated industrial power, normalized for federal authority. It professionalized the military. It deepened divisions between urban and rural life and hardened ideas about law, land, and citizenship. The Civil War had decided whether Union would survive, and the West decided what kind of Union it would be. The story of the West after Appomattox is not a side chapter to the Civil War. It's a continuation, fought with railroads instead of regiments, treaties instead of surrendering terms, and families instead of armies. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this really, really quick episode because we're getting into the West here in just a little bit. But thank you for listening. And remember, history isn't boring. It's the story of a nation that ended a war and immediately began the harder work of greater expansion from small colonies to a greater nation. See you next time.